Today we're going to talk about how you can max out your scenes and make them as efficient as they can possibly be. What's up guys, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer, I'm the author of Bad Parts, and welcome to my writing channel. This past week I decided to take a look at Spider-Man 2 for the first time in over a decade, and it was one of those dangerous situations because anytime you revisit something that you enjoyed as a kid or a teenager, you take a huge emotional risk. I mean, you're basically gambling your positive memories from the past and hoping that that movie is held up and that it still holds true even though you're smarter, even though you know more about the craft of writing. And when I put Spider-Man 2 on the line this week, I was very nervous, but thankfully it's still a great movie. The only thing that really didn't age well is the CGI, but the actual story is still phenomenal. And one thing that I really appreciated about the story is how the writers managed to make the scenes so efficient. And that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. I'm going to have examples later on from Spider-Man 2, but we're going to talk about making your scenes as efficient as they can possibly be. And when I talk about efficiency, I mean that a scene should incorporate the main plot as well as its subplots. It should find a way to mesh them together, just bring them into contact with one another in order to make the scene even better. Now, just so we're clear, when I talk about the main plot, I'm talking about your story's central core conflict. This is what drives the story. This is what the story is about at its core. That's your main plot. And when I talk about subplots, I'm talking about your supporting plots. And these can be something like a romantic subplot, you can have a mentor subplot, you can have a family subplot, so on and so on. These subplots, what they do is they support the main plot. They enhance it in some way, they freshen things up a little bit, they make things more meaningful. If you just have the main plot on its own, it's eventually going to get boring because it's just going to be a back and forth between hero and antagonist. But if you find ways to incorporate subplots, that gives your story some depth, some meaning, some richness. Now, ideally, you want your main plot and your subplots to overlap as often as possible, especially in the story's larger moments. If you have a big confrontation, it helps if you have that overlap. If you have a major character moment, it also helps if you have some kind of subplot factoring into that main plot. Whenever you have big moments, you want to be combining things because that's what really brings a story to life. I mean, I think there's some limits on it. Like, you don't want, for instance, you don't want every single scene to incorporate your main plot and every single one of your subplots. You don't want the main plot crashing into 8 or 9 different subplots or anything like that. It's not that you should be having 9 different subplots. I mean, that's a lot, but you don't want that kind of thing to happen where you have too much going on. So it's all about finding balance, and this is something that you will learn over the course of your writing career as you're experimenting with different scenes and you're testing out different methods and seeing where your story goes. Now let's talk about Spider-Man 2. And with Spider-Man 2, I think this is a great example because the main plot of Spider-Man 2 is pretty much in every single scene. Now, if I asked you what the main plot of Spider-Man 2 was, if you haven't seen the movie in a while, you'd probably say something like, well, it's about Spider-Man versus Dr. Octopus. He has to stop Dr. Octopus from nuking the city with his little science experiment. And that is not, in fact, the main plot. The main plot of Spider-Man 2 is not Spider-Man versus Dr. Octopus. The main plot is Spider-Man versus Peter Parker. And that's why this story is so compelling. This is why a lot of people consider this to be one of the best superhero movies out there, because it's a story about a man versus himself, and it's about all that internal conflict and the idea of Peter wanting to be someone while being forced to be someone else, or at least feeling obligated to be someone else. And he wants different things, but he needs different things, and he has to find a way to try and reconcile them. He has to sacrifice the things he wants in order to protect people. And this is a constant back and forth over the course of the story. I'm pretty sure it's in every scene, or at least close to it every scene. And that's what makes this story so well done, because the main plot is constantly present, and then you support it with various subplots. Now, some of the main subplots in Spider-Man 2 include the romantic subplot with Mary Jane Watson. It includes the crime-fighting subplot where Spidey is trying to protect people or stop criminals from getting what they want, or stop Dr. Octopus from creating a scenario where the city is destroyed by his science experiment. You also have a family subplot with Aunt May, who is beating herself up because she believes she's responsible for her husband's death, when in fact it's actually Peter's fault. You also have a revenge subplot with Harry Osborn. Harry, of course, wants revenge on Spider-Man for killing his father in the first movie. Then you also have a career/financial subplot where Peter Parker is trying to find a balance in his life. He's trying to keep his part-time jobs and trying to get enough money to pay the rent, and he's also trying to succeed in school, and this is of course a hard thing to do while he's has to be Spider-Man. And then there might be another subplot here and there, but I'm just going to try and keep things as simple as possible for this video. But just so you're aware, there are multiple subplots in Spider-Man 2, and they constantly factor into the main plot of Peter Parker's identity crisis, that Peter Parker versus Spider-Man main conflict. Now let's take a look at some of the major scenes in Spider-Man 2 and how they manage to be efficient. We'll start by looking at the opening scene, and this is a great opening scene because it instantly thrusts us into his identity crisis. We open up with him seeing the billboard for Mary Jane Watson, seeing what he wants, but he's got a job. He's got to take care of his job as a pizza delivery boy, and this is his financial subplot, his career subplot, whatever you want to call it. This is something he's also focused on. But he also is struggling with this, and he's struggling with this because he also has to be Spider-Man. He has to protect people whenever he can, and this is getting in the way of his daily life, and we see this from the opening scene. It's a great example that sets up for the rest of the story. It's basically the novel in miniature, as I talked about in one of my previous videos on opening up your chapters. It shows that this is Peter Parker. He is a man divided. He cannot be two people at once, but he is trying very hard and struggling at it. Another scene that incorporates multiple subplots is the bank scene. Now this is where Dr. Octopus robs the bank. I feel like a lot of writers would just write this scene with Dr. Octopus simply going into the bank, doing some cool villainy things, and then taking the money and leaving. But the writers of this movie did a great job of incorporating Peter Parker into this scene, bringing the main conflict in here where it could have easily just been one of those cutaway scenes where we just see the villain. Instead, it opens up with Peter taking his Aunt May to the bank. This is the family subplot. She's dealing with some financial issues because her husband is gone, so she's trying to open up a bank account in hopes of saving her home. She unfortunately cannot do it, and while they're at the bank, all of a sudden the crime-fighting subplot kicks in, and this is where Dr. Octopus bursts in. He tries opening up the safe, he gets his money, and he tries to leave with it, but Peter Parker leaves. He actually ditches his Aunt May, which is a great sign of the identity crisis here. He can't even be there for his aunt in this terrible situation. He ditches his Aunt May, leaves the building, and comes back as Spider-Man in order to fight off Dr. Octopus. And then one more scene that merges the main plot with multiple subplots is the coffee shop scene. And this is, of course, where Peter Parker meets with Mary Jane Watson at the coffee shop. This starts off looking like it's going to be a romantic subplot scene and nothing more, but it does incorporate his identity crisis there. He's struggling with how he feels about her. She asks him, "Do you love me?" And he says, "I don't," because he is committed to being Spider-Man. And during the scene, Dr. Octopus crashes the party, and he does this because he needs to capture Spider-Man in exchange for the tritium that Harry Osborn has. They have a deal going behind the scenes, so this is where the revenge subplot is factoring into this scene. And then, of course, Dr. Octopus, he takes Mary Jane hostage, forcing Peter Parker to go find Spider-Man, and in this case, he finds him by having this rebirth of his spider powers, and the scene ends with him going into Spider-Man mode and essentially getting back into that crime-fighting subplot. So as you can see, these three scenes do a great job of keeping the story focused on that main plot, that identity crisis, that Peter versus Spider-Man storyline. And they also make it more interesting by incorporating the different subplots, whether it's the romance, whether it's the crime-fighting, whatever it may be. These things enhance the story. When you bring in subplots and you do it well, you enhance your story. You make it better than what it could just be on its own. So always keep that in mind. Ask yourself, when I'm writing my story and when I'm writing especially the major moments, the major scenes in my story, how can I take my main plot, how can I keep it in the foreground while also bringing in different subplots in order to freshen it up, to add flavor, and to add meaning. If you do this, you will write better scenes and better stories. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: what is your favorite movie, and can you name one scene from that movie that involves both the main plot and at least one of the major subplots? let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of Bad Parts if you haven't already. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, hit the like and subscribe buttons for me, share this video with a friend, and as always, remember to keep on writing.